Good morning, Year 10. I hope you're well. Welcome to Thursday's video lesson. Before we get into it, I just want to give you a reminder about the expectations that I have of you when submitting work. If I ask you to complete 2 paragraphs in purple pen to redraft your responses, I expect you to do 2 purple pen redraft paragraphs. It is absolutely ridiculous that some of you are submitting work that is incomplete or of poor quality. You wouldn't do it in the classroom, so you shouldn't be doing it during remote learning. I expect better of all of you. We won't be revisiting language paper 1 for some time. We're going to be moving on to new content, which means you need to be taking this opportunity to improve your language paper 1 responses. With that being said, today we're going to continue with our feedback. So please do make sure that you have your language paper 1 responses from the 4th and the 5th of February. As always, if you don't have this, there is a model version on Show My Homework for you to use. Pause the video and make sure you have that in front of you, please. Okay, if you're back, that means you're ready to write the title, date, and the learning objective. Pause the video and press play when you have those 3 things written down. Okay, now it's time to complete the do now. I would like you to complete the 5 tasks below, as always. Numbers 3, 4, and 5 need to be written in full sentences, please. Pause the video and complete these 5 tasks now. Okay, if you're back, that means you're ready to make your purple pen corrections. Please don't be lazy here and do make sure that you are writing the correct answers in purple pen. So, for agree, you could replace it with acknowledge, recognise, or concur. And for disagree, you could replace it with counter, refute, and oppose. You might have something different here, and I'll look at those when you send your work. But I also recommend getting the ones on screen down so you have a bank of words that you can refer back to throughout today's lesson. You must refer back to the statement throughout your question 4, as ultimately you're being marked on how well you evaluate the statement. You should write 4 paragraphs for question 4. And question 4 is worth 20 marks, which makes it 25% of the paper. So it's important that we get this right. So let's have a reminder of what question 4 looked like in the assessment. Focus this part of your answer on the second part of the source from line 24 to the end. The student said, "I wasn't at all surprised by the disappearance of the stranger child at the end of the extract. The writer has left us in no doubt that she is just part of Rosie's imagination. To what extent do you agree?" In your response, you could consider the disappearance of the stranger child, evaluate how the writer presents the stranger child, and support your responses with references to the text. So, as a reminder, it's always important to recognise that the statement will always come in 2 parts, with 2 sentences. This statement was quite challenging, I have to admit. I think it was quite hard for you to wrap your head around this idea about the writer leaving us with no doubt. It's quite challenging to evaluate. Ultimately, one of the main problems we have with question 4 and the rest of the paper was that we simply didn't write enough. And we're going to kind of talk about that today and talk about how we can improve our responses. So let's talk about what we did well. So I was really impressed with your selection of quotes to support your argument about the statement. And you might be like, well, madam, we've done this for years. I know how to pick quotes. But to pick quotes based on an argument for a statement that was quite challenging, it's quite impressive that we managed to pick such a wide variety of quotes that were very accurate. So, for example, this quote here: "Contrastingly, it may be argued that the author described the little girl from Rosie's point of view so accurately that we almost began to believe that what she was seeing was real. When describing the little girl, Rosie registered that the girl was left-handed like herself and that there was something animal-like in her movements. The student continued to analyse the verb registered and kind of what that process actually looks like. And that's a great quote to support a challenging argument to disagree with a statement. We also had one like this. However, I may argue with the view as the child seems to be relaxed at the start. As Rosie found the strange child, the child was sitting on her heels. As you can see, there is a huge difference between these responses. This one has short bursts of relevant quotes linked to an argument about the statement, whereas this doesn't have an argument about the statement, and the quotes aren't appropriate, and nor are they big enough for the student to analyse in detail. So what I would like you to do is go to your question 4 response and highlight where you have used relevant quotes to support your argument about the statement. So for this student here, they would highlight these quotes: registered, girl is left-handed like herself, and animal-like in her movements. And this student wouldn't highlight anything because they haven't picked relevant quotes to support an argument. Pause the video and complete this task now, please. Okay, if you're back, that means you've highlighted your quotes if they are relevant. Now we are going to talk about our EBI. So one of the main things that I kind of noticed was that some of us seem to not be talking about the lines that were specified in the question 4 response. Only a couple of us, but it's really important that we nip this in the bud now. So as you can see, when I looked at the extract, I instantly drew a kind of line / box around the lines and then wrote question 4. So I knew that this is the only part of the text that I could write about. Also, a lot of us didn't seem to plan, and I did talk about the importance of planning your argument before writing so that this argument is threaded throughout your response. To do that, before you write, you should make this little table of agree and disagree. You can do it next to the extract, or you can do it on the space that you have to write question 4 and then just put a cross through it at the end. So I'm going to show you how I would plan for this response. So I personally think it's quite challenging to disagree with this statement. So I will probably pick 4 reasons for agree. So I'm going to first talk about actually I'm just going to pick a different colour just for the sake of the fact that there's already some red pen on the screen. I'm going to pick green. I'm going to talk about this idea of a homemade Cinderella costume. It almost seems like it's like a fairy tale, and therefore, quite like a fantasy and imaginary. I also quite like this idea about like a quick furtive movement. If something is furtive, it means it's kind of like quite unnatural, and it just seemed a bit strange. So I'm going to use another argument to talk about the unnatural behaviour of the stranger child and how that proves that she isn't real. I'm also going to kind of talk about the animal-like movements and the darting of a mouse. It just kind of seems quite like, it's almost like shifty, and like kind of like sly. It doesn't seem natural. And then I probably would talk about the final line here. The child was gone, and I talk about the kind of the declaration of her disappearance. So as you can see here, I've got 4 reasons in my table, and they are also matched up with 4 quotations. So I have a plan for my response already. So now what I would like you to do, I'm just going to rub that last little bit out there so you can see it. What I would like you to do is copy out this table, a blank version of this table. Go to your question 4 response and copy your agree and disagree reasons into the table. So your table should be full of the reasons that you have used throughout your question 4 response. So it will look different to mine. Pause the video and complete this task now, please. Okay, if you're back, that means you have a copy of the table with reasons that's linked to your question 4 response. Now, with that in mind, remember that you don't have to disagree with a statement. I said this very, very, very clearly multiple times when we looked at question 4 originally. You don't always have to disagree. You will not be penalised if you don't disagree. You can write 4 paragraphs of agree. You can write 3 agree, 1 disagree, 2 disagree, 2 agree. It doesn't matter, but you don't have to disagree. A lot of us tried to disagree with this statement, and we ended up writing some quite nonsensical things that wouldn't really gain many marks. For example, contrastingly, it may be argued that it was not a figure of Rosie's mind. After Rosie, Sam, and Cara had moved in, Rosie had made a check of the garden. She was curious. This juxtaposes the idea the little girl is in her imagination, as she checked as only person who still retains sanity would. Again, that doesn't really make sense. It's not a strong enough argument. I mean, it says something like this. However, it may be argued that the girl's disappearance was a surprise and was real. If that doesn't really make sense. When describing the garden, the writer something ancient mulberry tree and a padlocked door, giving the garden an aura of magic and secrecy. This implying that the girl is also magical, and she just disappears within a blink, enforcing the idea that this is real and not Rosie's imagination. But we've said that there's a kind of a magical aura, but then we're saying that makes her real. So again, argument that doesn't make sense. So what I want you to do now is be critical of your own work. I want you to go to the table that you just made with your reasons from your question 4, and I want you to make sure that they are realistic and that they can be supported by evidence. If they sound anything like the 2 that we just looked at, you might want to rethink your reasons. Pause the video and complete that task now, please. Okay, so you should now have a table with 4 appropriate reasons based on the statement, and we should be avoiding any kind of flimsy disagreements like the ones we saw on screen. Okay, now let's focus on our main EBIs. So, firstly, with question 4, it's a kind of a mini essay that's worth 20 marks. So it's important that we include a brief thesis to outline your argument based on the statement. I didn't introduce this to you the first time we did question 4 because I wanted us to focus on getting the 4 paragraphs down, but some of us are at the stage where we can start including a thesis. This is the checklist that I would like you to use to do this. So firstly, you want to introduce your argument. So you can use any of these phrases here. The reason that there is no disagree phrase here is because there is always scope to agree. So if you fully agree, you would use I agree that. And if you kind of agree and disagree, you would use something like this. You will never start your thesis saying I disagree with a statement because there is always scope to agree. Then you want to interpret the statement to show that you have understood it. So you want to talk about what the writer is showing in relation to the statement. And then if you have one, you can reference different points of view. So on the other hand, although, however, it may be argued. This is obviously an optional step depending on the statement. When you're writing your thesis, you need to show that you've understood and developed a point of view on the statement by interpreting the statement. You have this statement, you have your response, and you're going to interpret it and create your own point of view. So what does this look like? I'm going to show you how I would write a thesis based on the question that we looked at for White Fang. So let's remind ourselves. The statement says, this section of the text where we learn what happened in the struggle between White Fang and the intruder makes me feel desperately sorry for White Fang. And I'm going to now use this checklist to write a thesis based on this statement. So let me just get my pen. So I am going to start off with introducing my argument. So I'm going to write, in my opinion. So I've done that. And then I'm going to interpret the statement to show that you've understood it. So the statement is asking me primarily about the struggle and the idea of sympathy. So I'm going to interpret those two terms and show that I've understood what they mean and write this. I'm going to write, the writer presents the struggle as vicious and brutal. So I've interpreted the word struggle. Now I'm going to interpret sorry, which causes White Fang to be in pain and fatigued. So I've interpreted what I think about the struggle and why I feel sorry for White Fang. So I've done the interpreting of the statement, and then do I have a different point of view? Yes, I do. So I'm going to write, however, it may be argued. So I'm using this one here, and now I'm going to give my opposing point of view. However, it may be argued that the struggle is so brutal that it causes more harm to the intruder. Full stop. Okay. And then that is done. So I've written my thesis and I've interpreted the statement. What your thesis is not is just repeating the statement. You're not going to write in your thesis, I agree that this section of the text where we learn what happened in the struggle between White Fang and the intruder makes me feel desperately sorry for White Fang. That is not interpreting the statement. You're just retelling me what the statement is and saying you agree. Interpreting the statement shows that you have an understanding of the statement and therefore you've developed a point of view. I understand what the struggle was like, and I've described that in my thesis, and I've understood how that creates sympathy for White Fang because it shows that he's in pain and fatigued. So this is what a thesis for question 4 looks like. So now it is your turn. So I'm just going to rub my thesis out. You can always rewind if you want to have a look at the thesis and kind of write along with me. It might be a good idea to play the video and write your thesis along with me. But what I would like you to do is to use the checklist that I have just used on the left hand side to write a thesis in purple pen for your question 4 based on your statement about the stranger child. It would need to make sure that it would need to link to the reasons that you have outlined in your table. You can either do it directly onto your language paper 1 assessment, or if you don't have a lot of room, you can do it underneath today's date and title. I don't care, as long as you write a thesis in purple pen for your question 4 based on the statement about the stranger child. Pause the video and complete this task now, please. Okay, if you're back, that means you should have a thesis, and we can move on to our next EBI, which is ensuring that you evaluate the statement in relation to your evidence. So you need to ask yourself, what does my chosen quote show, and how does this support the statement? So let's have a look at this example from a student here. Firstly, I agree with the statement that the writer left us in no doubt that she is just in Rose's imagination because her children don't notice this child. When describing the girl, the writer states that Cara seemed unfazed by the girl's presence. This is a great quote, good argument. They continue to say, the fact that the writer used the adjective unfazed makes us think that there isn't any child there, because if there was a random child that you've never seen, I doubt anyone would be unfazed. And then they go on to make a link and an overall idea. And as you can see, I've highlighted this and I've labelled it off. And here I've written this question. How does this support the statement? You've chosen good evidence. You've mentioned what the quote shows, but this student hasn't gone the next step and told us how this quote and what it shows supports the statement. So how do we make sure that we do this? So this is the checklist that we use for question 4. And our focus is going to be on these 2 steps here, the identifying and analysing devices and explaining how it supports the statement in lots of detail. Remember, with question 4, you can talk about structure and language, so you can reuse some of your ideas from earlier paragraphs. I'm going to write my first paragraph to ensure that I evaluate the statement in relation to my evidence. So I'm just going to end my slideshow, and I always forget to close my emails before I start recording my lessons. I'm just going to close that. All right, so I have on a separate screen, I have the reasons that I put in my table earlier on. And my first reason was about the Cinderella costume and how that kind of makes the stranger child seem almost like a fairy tale. So I'm going to do this step first. I'm going to say why I agree with the statement. So I'm going to say, firstly, I agree that the writer has left no doubt that the stranger child is part of Rosie's imagination. And now I need to say why I agree with the statement. I can't just say that I agree or disagree. I need to explain why I think that, and that's going to be the focus of my paragraph. I'm going to write, because she is portrayed as an almost fairy tale character. Okay, so that's my first step done. I've explained why I agree with the statement, giving a specific reason. Oh, that's not what I meant to do. Okay, next I'm going to embed my quotations. As always, I'm going to say, when the writer describes the girl's appearance, and I know what quote I'm going to use because I underlined it in my extract and then linked that to my reason. So when the writer describes the girl's appearance, she is described as having a dress like a homemade Cinderella costume. That is the quote that I'm going to be focusing on. So that step there is done. Okay, now I need to identify and analyze devices. So looking at this, probably not going to analyze structure, but it is a simile, so I'm going to analyze that. So firstly, I need to state what the device is, so the simile, and then I'm going to explain how it works. The simile is a comparison, so I'm going to write that the simile compares her clothes to that of a fairy tale character. I don't actually think you need the hyphen there. Fairy tale character. And now I'm going to analyse it explaining what it suggests about the stranger child, what it highlights about the stranger child. So I'm going to write which suggests that I'm going to say she doesn't exist in reality, but in a type of fantasy in Rosie's mind. So I've identified a device, I've explained how it works, and then I've evaluated it by explaining what my chosen quote shows and how does this support the statement is my next step. I'm going to go further. So I'm going to write fairy tales. Oh, fairy tales. So when you think of a fairy tale, you think of like just it's all fantasy, nothing's real, it's myth, it's magical, it's all kind of unexplained. So I'm going to write fairy tales are full of unexplained events. So I'm going to link back to my statement. It doesn't seem surprising that the stranger child could be a part of Rosie's imagination, or that she could have disappeared. And by mentioning that idea of disappearance, I've hit both of the parts of the statement. I've talked about the fact that it's no surprise that the child could have disappeared, and I've talked about the fact that the writer left no doubt that the stranger child is part of Rosie's imagination. So there I have done my explanation and analysis. And again, notice that that takes up a large portion of our paragraph, as it should, because that is what we're being marked on. Now I'm going to link. So I'm going to say this idea that the child is portrayed as a fairy tale character. Oh, fairy tale character is seen earlier in the extract when, and again, mentioning the fact that something is seen earlier or later is showing an awareness of the structure of the text. Then I'm going to embed a different quotation to support this view. I'm going to write when the writer describes her dusty looking plait. And do I leave it there? Nope, I need to explain how that supports my idea very briefly, as it emphasizes her fairy, I don't want to say fairy, kind of like her fantastical, is that the right word? As it emphasizes her fantastical appearance. I think that's the right word. I don't know if fantastical like in that way means like fantastic or if it actually means like fantasy. I'm sure it means fantasy. Let me double check. Yeah, like being like strange or weird or fairy tale like. So I've done that step there. And then I am going to write my overall message. What is the writer trying to show the reader about the stranger child? So I'm going to write overall. I'm going to use that sentence starter. The writer presents that the. Now I'm going to link back to the question, the statement, that the stranger child is a part of Rosie's imagination because the writer highlights her almost magical and unrealistic appearance. And that is done. So here as you can see, I have evaluated the statement in relation to my evidence. I've analysed what does my chosen quote show by talking about the simile, and then I've explained how this supports the statement. Just like in the literature paper, when I say you need to analyse your words and then you need to tell me how that supports your overall idea, this is what you do here. But instead, you say how it supports the statement. So what I would like you to do now is copy this example down into your books in purple pen. That way you have a concrete example that you can refer back to during tomorrow's lesson. Pause the video and copy this paragraph down now, please. Okay, so you should have this paragraph down in purple pen. It might also be a good idea to highlight the section in green so you are aware of what I mean when I say evaluating the statement. Pause the video and highlight that section in green now. Okay, so now you are ready to submit your work. Before you do that, tomorrow's lesson isn't going to be a video, but I'm going to explain it very clearly now so I do not receive any incomplete work. Tomorrow you are going to complete a redraft of your question 4 response. You've already purple penned your thesis. You've already got an example paragraph that you've copied down from me. So you need to write 3 purple pen redrafted paragraphs for question 4 in relation to the reasons in your table. If you are unsure about how to do that, I will be obviously available on my emails all day, so let me know. But I will not be accepting work that doesn't contain 3 purple pen redraft question 4 paragraphs. I want to make myself very clear about that. Okay, today you need to submit your work. Please remember your email subject should look like this. I want to see a picture of the highlighting that you did on your original response, as well as the thesis that you've written today underneath the title, date and LO. Pause the video, submit your work, and then you can exit out and continue with your rest of your lessons. I look forward to seeing your question 4 redrafts tomorrow. Have an excellent weekend, and I will speak to you in Monday's video lesson.